Most people think emotional burnout is obvious, that it shows up as constant stress, total exhaustion, or falling apart in public. But the truth is, burnout rarely starts that loud. It begins quietly, mixing into your daily life, convincing you that you're just tired, busy, or handling things. You don't have to be overwhelmed to be emotionally drained. Here's how to spot the silent signs early. Emotional burnout rarely starts with stress. That's the part most people misunderstand. Stress is loud, burnout is quiet. Burnout begins when pressure becomes normal and rest becomes optional. It starts when your mind adapts to emotional overload instead of resisting it. And because adaptation looks like strength, most people don't realize what's happening until much later. In psychology, burnout is described as a state of emotional, mental, and psychological exhaustion caused by prolonged emotional demand, not intensity, duration. That's an important distinction. You don't burn out because of one hard week or one bad situation. You burn out because your nervous system stays activated for too long without enough recovery. And the earliest signs don't feel alarming, they feel reasonable. You still function, you still show up, and you still do what needs to be done. That's why burnout hides so well. One of the first signs of emotional burnout is an emotional dulling. You don't feel deeply upset, you also don't feel deeply excited. Your emotional range narrows. Psychologists call this emotional blunting. Your brain learns that strong emotional reactions cost energy, and when energy is limited, it starts reducing emotional output. This is especially common in people who deal with constant responsibility, emotional labor, or long-term pressure. You don't stop caring, you just stop feeling as much. This is why emotional burnout is often mistaken for emotional maturity. You seem calmer, less reactive, and less dramatic. People might even compliment you for being so grounded, but internally there's a difference between being regulated and being emotionally muted. Regulation allows flexibility, and burnout removes it. Over time, this emotional dulling becomes your baseline. You forget what emotional engagement used to feel like, and because nothing feels dramatically wrong, you assume nothing is wrong at all. Another early sign of emotional burnout is the quiet weight that comes with caring. Conversations feel draining, even when they're not difficult. Listening requires effort, responding feels like work, and you still want to be there for people, but your internal capacity is lower. This is emotional fatigue. Burnout doesn't make you stop caring, it makes caring cost more. And when caring costs more than your system can afford, withdrawal begins gradually. You reply slower, you engage less deeply, and you avoid emotionally demanding topics without consciously deciding to. Psychologically, this is your nervous system protecting itself. Prolonged emotional output without replenishment leads to depletion. And when depletion sets in, the brain prioritizes self-preservation over connection. This is why emotionally burnt out people often feel misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like distance. On the inside, it feels like survival. Moreover, burnout also shows up as irritability, but not the explosive kind. At this point, your patience is thinner. Small inconveniences feel disproportionately annoying. You're more sensitive to noise, interruptions, or inefficiency. You might even recognize that your reactions feel out of character. This happens because emotional burnout reduces your cognitive and emotional buffering capacity. When your system is rested, it can absorb stress without reacting strongly. When it's depleted, even strong stressors push you past your threshold. Neuroscience links this to prolonged cortisol exposure. When stress hormones remain elevated over time, the brain's emotional regulation centers become less efficient, and you're more tired. This is why burnout often gets mislabeled as personality change. People think they've become more negative or short-tempered. In reality, their nervous system has less room to maneuver. One of the most dangerous phases of emotional burnout is high-functioning emptiness. You're productive, you meet expectations, you handle responsibilities. Nothing appears broken, but emotionally, there's a sense of detachment from what you're doing. Chronic emotional stress affects dopamine regulation, which is responsible for motivation and satisfaction. You can still perform, but the emotional feedback loop is weakened. You do things because you should, not because they feel meaningful. This state can last a long time, especially in achievement-oriented environments. Society often reinforces it. You're praised for being reliable, pushing through, and not letting emotions get in the way. But internally, the disconnect grows. This is how burnout becomes invisible. One early but overlooked sign of emotional burnout is ineffective rest. You take breaks, but they don't restore you. You sleep, but you don't feel refreshed. You have time off, but your mind stays restless. This happens because burnout shifts your nervous system into a semi-permanent state of alertness. Even during rest, your system doesn't fully downregulate. Psychologically, calm starts to feel unfamiliar and stillness feels uncomfortable. You might notice yourself filling every quiet moment with stimulation, scrolling, watching something, and keeping noise on in the background because silence feels unsettling. This is a regulation issue. Your system has forgotten how to fully relax because it hasn't felt safe enough to do so in a long time. Burnout also changes how you talk to yourself, often without you noticing. Your internal voice becomes more dismissive. You minimize your exhaustion. You invalidate your own emotional signals. You tell yourself you're overreacting, being dramatic, or just need to try harder. This is common in people who value responsibility and resilience. Over time, they internalize the idea that their needs are secondary, that resting is a weakness. that emotional discomfort should be ignored. Psychologically, this creates an internal conflict. Your body signals fatigue, your mind overrides it. And the more often this happens, the less you trust your own internal cues. This loss of self-trust is one of the most damaging aspects of emotional burnout. You stop listening to yourself, and when that happens, burnout deepens quietly. In most cases, early indicator is reduced creativity. You still think clearly, but your thinking becomes narrower, more rigid, and less exploratory. Burnout pushes the brain into efficiency mode. It prioritizes what's necessary and familiar. Novelty feels taxing. Playfulness feels unnecessary. Imagination feels distant. Sometimes, sleep issues often appear before people realize they're burnt out, but they don't always look severe. You might fall asleep easily but wake up tired. Or you sleep enough hours but feel tense upon waking, or your sleep becomes lighter and less restorative. This is where emotional burnout affects autonomic nervous system regulation. Your body doesn't fully enter deep sleep states. Even during sleep, stress processing continues. Because this happens gradually, many people normalize it. They assume it's part of adulthood, but psychologically, constant non-restorative sleep is a major burnout indicator. One of the quietest but most serious signs of emotional burnout is reduced self-empathy. You still show compassion to others. You still understand their struggles. But when it comes to yourself, you become emotionally distant. You stop checking in, then you push through discomfort instead of addressing it. This emotional self-neglect accelerates burnout because it removes the internal support system that usually buffers stress. Oftentimes, emotional burnout doesn't announce itself because it grows in people who are good at coping, good at adapting, good at handling pressure. These traits delay recognition. Burnout hides responsibility behind competence and silence. And the danger isn't that burnout makes you stop functioning, it's that it lets you keep functioning while slowly disconnecting you from yourself. By the time burnout reaches its second phase, most people don't recognize it as burnout anymore. They assume this is just who they've become. And because the shift happens slowly, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like a personality change. This is where burnout becomes dangerous. Psychology shows that prolonged emotional exhaustion reshapes perception. It changes how you interpret effort, connection, and even yourself. At this stage, people stop asking what's wrong and start adapting to depletion as if it's permanent. One of the clearest signs of deeper emotional burnout is avoidance that feels logical. Conversations feel heavy and decisions feel draining. You begin choosing the path of least emotional resistance because your system is conserving energy. This is emotional minimization. You reduce exposure to anything that might require emotional engagement. Psychologically, this is self-protection, but over time, avoidance reinforces itself. The less you engage, the harder engagement feels. The brain associates emotional interaction with effort instead of reward, and slowly your world shrinks. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of burnout. People assume they have become introverted, antisocial, or detached. In reality, their emotional capacity has been depleted for too long. In deeper burnout, motivation doesn't disappear completely. It becomes conditional. You can still act, but only when there's urgency, pressure, or external consequence. You wait until the last minute. You rely on deadlines, fear, or obligation to get moving. Without pressure, everything feels heavy. This happens because emotional burnout disrupts internal drive systems. Meanwhile, motivation requires emotional energy. When that energy is depleted, the brain leans on stress hormones to compensate. You don't move because you want to. You move because you have to. Over time, this creates a cycle where stress becomes the only fuel source, and while it works temporarily, it deepens exhaustion long term. Another sign of advanced burnout is identity confusion. You know who you are logically, but you don't feel connected to it emotionally. Values feel distant. Goals feel abstract. You might even question things you once deeply cared about. This doesn't mean your values have changed. It means burnout has disconnected you from emotional meaning. This is often referred to as depersonalization. Not in a clinical sense, but in an experiential one. You feel less like an active participant in your own life, and more like an observer going through motions. This is why emotional burnt out people often say they feel lost, even if their life looks stable on paper. The structure is there, but the connection just isn't. As burnout progresses, the brain learns that emotional engagement leads to exhaustion. So it starts shutting emotions down preemptively. This is an emotional shutdown. You might notice that intense situations don't affect you the way they used to. You don't feel as moved, as bothered, and as invested. Numbing is the nervous system's last defense against overload. It reduces pain by reducing sensation, but it also reduces joy, connection, and meaning. This is why burnout often coexists with a sense of emptiness. One of the reasons emotional burnout goes unaddressed is because acknowledging it feels threatening. For many people, their identity is tied to competence, reliability, or resilience. Admitting burnout feels like admitting weakness. If you believe you can't stop, you convince yourself nothing is wrong. You normalize exhaustion. You intellectualize it. You tell yourself everyone feels this way. But normalization just delays intervention. The major reason burnout is ignored is because there's no clear endpoint. Stress has an end. Burnout feels endless. And when people don't see a clear solution, they avoid naming the problem. As emotional burnout deepens, emotional loneliness increases. Even when you're around people, you feel disconnected. Conversations stay surface level. Vulnerability feels exhausting. This is because vulnerability requires emotional resources you don't have. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. You feel alone because you're burned out, and burnout deepens because you're emotionally alone. It has been proven consistently that emotional connection is a buffer against stress. When burnout removes connection, recovery becomes harder. Many people assume burnout can be fixed with a break, a vacation, time off. And while rest helps, it doesn't resolve emotional burnout on its own. That's because burnout is dysregulation. Your nervous system has learned a pattern of overactivation and emotional suppression. Time off without emotional recalibration often leads to temporary relief followed by rapid relapse. This is why people return from breaks feeling briefly better and then quickly depleted again. The underlying pattern remains unchanged. Recovery requires more than rest. It requires restoring emotional responsiveness. Psychologically, the first step in burnout recovery is awareness without judgment, not labeling yourself as broken, not forcing change, just recognizing depletion honestly. The second step is reducing emotional output before increasing emotional input. Many people try to add joy, hobbies, or motivation while still overextending themselves. That doesn't work. The system needs relief before expansion. This means setting limits, not just on time, but on emotional labor, saying no to emotional demands, reducing exposure to draining interactions, allowing emotional withdrawal without guilt. Another critical factor is rebuilding self-trust, listening to internal signs again, responding to fatigue instead of overriding it. This is slow but essential. Burnout recovery is not about becoming productive again. It's about becoming responsive again. One of the final stages of recovery is relearning emotional presence, feeling without rushing, resting without distraction, connecting without performing. This feels uncomfortable at first because burnout trains the nervous system to avoid stillness, but gradually, emotional capacity returns. Psychology shows that emotional recovery happens through safety, not force, consistency, not intensity, and most importantly, through permission. Permission to slow down, feel less, and need more. The most important thing to understand about emotional burnout is this. It's not a personality trait. It's not a flaw. It's not who you've become. It's a state, a response, and a pattern where your nervous system adapted to survive prolonged demand, and patterns can change. Burnout convinces you that this version of you is permanent, but psychology says otherwise. With awareness, boundaries, and emotional recalibration, people discover their depth, motivation, and sense of self, but only if they stop treating exhaustion as normal. Above all, emotional shutdown doesn't happen suddenly. It's the result of long-term emotional neglect, coupled with ignoring signals and always adapting too well. The earlier burnout is acknowledged, the less it takes to reverse. That's why recognizing these deeper signs matters. They're not necessarily needed to diagnose yourself, but to intervene, because emotional burnout doesn't need to reach collapse to be valid. And the most powerful step is simply admitting that functioning is not the same as feeling alive. So what do you think? Have you noticed any of these signs in yourself or in someone close to you before they even realized they were burnt out? Truth is, emotional exhaustion doesn't always look the way we expect, and awareness is often the first step toward change. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this video helped you understand emotional burnout on a deeper level, make sure to like and subscribe for more psychology-driven breakdowns of the patterns that shape how we think, feel, and live.